Alright, so after the last video we ended up with this wood texture, which is pretty good, but we still need to add a little more details to this wood. So in this video we're gonna go ahead and add the rest of the details and finish our wood material. So let's begin. First I'm gonna move this map range node back a bit, and also I'm going to move this multiply node back here. And I'm gonna move pretty much everything else forward so that I have a lot more space to work with. Now let's zoom in here and duplicate this map node, this multiply node, and get rid of the label. Connect this over here like that, and for now let's set this value to 8 and duplicate it, set this to floor with here. And now we're gonna create a white noise node and make it 1D and connect this over. There we go. And this is our white noise, as you can see. Let me go back here and find the Z dimension. Let's move this here and create a reroute node. And now we're gonna add this white noise with this Z dimension. Create a math node and add the Z dimension with the white noise. And now let's create a Voronoi texture and make it 2D and connect this value to the vector input of the Voronoi texture. Okay, so let's see what's going on and increase the scale a bit. There we go. Now you can actually use the combine XYZ to combine the Z and the white noise. It's going to create pretty much the same result. It's slightly different, but it still look kind of the same. So I just use an add node for the sake of simplicity. So now this Voronoi texture is going to be our saw creases. But before we can use this Voronoi, we need to process it a little. So yeah, create a math node and power it by 2. There we go, so that we have a little more contrast. And create a color ramp node and move the key, the white key, back a bit to further increase the contrast and cut away some of the values here. Okay, so now this is ready to be used as the saw creases. And I'm just gonna use the soft light blend mode again to mix the color. There we go. And maybe increase this to 1 to see what's going on for now. And as you can see, we have some very nice looking creases. And now we can lower this factor value to decrease the creases. There we go. Now it looks pretty nice, right? And let me go back here and increase the scale of the Voronoi to make the saw creases a little smaller. Maybe increase a little more. There we go. Okay, so you can see we now have some super nice looking wood, but the problem with this wood is that it's perfectly smooth and there's no bumpiness whatsoever. So that's what we're gonna do next. We're gonna create a bump texture for our wood. So for the bump texture, we're gonna be using this band, black and white bands, and we're gonna combine it with the microtubes and the saw creases. Okay, so let's go ahead and make our bump material, texture. So select the band groups here and move them back. There we go, place them there. So this minimum node is going to be our band values, and we're gonna subtract the microtubes from this value. Okay, so create a map node and use subtract. Connect this map range node to the second value, and for the first value set it as 1. So here we have the invert of the microtubes, and now we can multiply this with something small, 0.1 for now. Next we're gonna use a subtract node to subtract this value from the bands. Okay, So go ahead and subtract. So you can see we have a little bit of variations in the bands. And yeah, let's create a bump map and see what is going on. Bump and connect this to the height and set the distance to something very small, maybe 0.01 for now. And let's connect this to the material and let's see. So you can see we now have some bumpiness going on, but yeah, we need to tweak this a little to make it more visible, but for now let's just leave them here. And next, let's go ahead and combine this height map with this creases. So again, we're gonna invert the creases before subtracting it from the height map here. So let's connect this to the second input. This one's gonna be 1 and use subtract. There we go. And again, multiply with something small to reduce the intensity. And finally, let's move these here. Subtract again. There we go. So now we have this bump map, and let's see. Get rid of the color so that we can see what's going on a little more clearly. And maybe increase the metallic and reduce the brightness of the color. So you can see we have some super nice looking bump map here. And yeah, I think we should go ahead and tweak the bump map a bit. Now you can increase or decrease the effects of the creases by this multiply. For example, if you set this to 0, you will have no horizontal creases at all. And if you set this to 1, you have a lot of creases. I mean, the creases will become super deep. And yeah, it's overwhelming and we can't see anything else. So let's go ahead and set this back to something smaller. Maybe 0.05, maybe. Okay, let's leave it as 0.05 for now. Alright, let's go ahead and check out the bump map. Now, I think the creases are a little too sharp, so we can't really see the bump of the creases. So maybe we can use this Voronoi texture instead of the map range. So let's cut this wire. And as you can see, we now have a lot of creases, but the creases are too strong and overwhelming, so lower it to yeah, maybe this. Let's see the result. Yeah, it looks pretty good, but maybe just set this to 0.05. There we go. Okay, let's go ahead and reconnect the base color and get rid of the metallic value to see our wood. Okay, so you can see the wood texture is a lot better now with the bump map and the horizontal creases and stuff. But yeah, it's not there yet because we still need to create the specularity as well as the roughness. But first, let's go ahead and create a wood node group because it's becoming kind of a mess right now. Alright, select everything except for the original texture coordinate, the bump, and the material. Select everything else and Ctrl G to group them. And yeah, let's go ahead and rearrange our nodes a bit. So I'm gonna create a frame here, and I'm gonna call this frame the micro tubes. There we go. And move all of these nodes into the micro tubes. There we go. And I'm gonna create another frame and call this one bands. There we go. And move everything here into this frame. There we go. And leave these outside as well as these. And these nodes are going to be our saw creases. So create another frame and call it saw creases. There we go. And move all of these nodes in. Alright, we need to extract a bit of information from this whole messy group to use later on. So let's move this here. The next thing we need to extract is the bands. So Control Shift and click on the bands and go back here and cut the wire and connect it to the output to create another float output, and get rid of the viewer and rename this bands and move it up. There we go. Alright, now let's go find our color ramp node, this one here. This one is the color variation, I believe. So let's go ahead and duplicate the height and call this one taint or whatever, or maybe color variations or whatever. I just call it taint. And next is this map range node. This is going to be the rod map, so let's connect it to the output as well. There we go. This is going to be the rod. There we go. And we also need to extract the microtubes as well as the creases. So connect this to the outputs as well. There we go. Now let's get rid of the viewer and connect this to the output. There we go. This is going to be the microtubes. There we go. And duplicate this microtubes and call it saw creases. And connect this color ramp to the output. There we go. So just rename this one to be wood generator. Now we're gonna be using the bands, the microtubes, and the saw creases to create the specularity and the roughness maps. So create a math node, and first I want to invert this band's information. So set this to subtract and 1 for the first value. This will invert the bands for me. And next I'm gonna multiply this with the microtubes and the saw creases. There we go. Let's see. Alright, seems to be fine to me. Alright, so now we're gonna create 2 map range nodes. One for the specularity and one for the roughness. Connect this to the specularity and connect this to the roughness slot. Alright, let's see. Now I want the minimum specularity to be maybe 0.2 and the maximum specularity to be 0.4, and for the maximum roughness, let's set this to 0.5 and the minimum roughness to 0.25. So let me switch to the world and get rid of the world material. And here I'm gonna place a few lamps to see how the wood behave in different light conditions. So set this to 1000 maybe, and move the light up and closer to the wood, and let's see. So as you can see, we have some super nice wood texture and it's behaving properly with the light. So let's go back to our object, the shader view, and let's configure our node group a bit more, because right now we only have one single vector input, and we need to control the wood texture generator somehow. So yeah, we're gonna create a bunch of input for our wood. Now create a vector map and set this to scale, and connect this scale to the input group. Alright, hit N to open this panel and change this to master scale, and minimum values to be 0. Next, we're gonna create some inputs for our warp. So yeah, this is the first warp, so connect the X and Y scale and the Z scale. And move the group input here and cut this wire and set this to maybe 2 and connect this to the group input. Now this is going to be our warp 1 strength, and the minimum value should be 0, and these scales should also have a 0 as the minimum value. There we go. Now the second warp and the third warp, the Z scale doesn't matter, so we only need to create the XY scale as well as the strength. So connect these here. There we go. And this is going to be our warp 2. Okay, next is the warp 3. Go here, connect the XY scale and the warp strength, and go here and change the name of the input. Okay, so now we can control our 3 levels of warping to control our wood. So let's go ahead and see. So you see our wood is a lot better now, and we can quickly generate a bunch of different wood materials using these inputs. So let's go ahead and create some more inputs. It's going to be a mess if we continue to connect pretty much everything to the same input group. So here I'm going to create another input group. It's basically the same. These 2 groups are going to be the same, but yeah, it's a lot more easier to understand the node group with multiple input groups. Now connect this multiply value to the input group, and this one is going to be the band randomness. There we go. And let's go back out and see what's going on. And by the way, we need to set the minimum and maximum value for our band. So this one is going to be 0 to 1. Let's visualize the band and set all those strengths to 0 to see the perfectly round bands. Okay, so if you increase the band randomness to 1, you can see we have a bunch of different random bands. But if we lower this to 0, we have perfectly uniform bands. So let's Ctrl Z to restore the strength of the warps. And let's continue to create some more inputs. Okay, the next is the band number. Let's cut this wire and set this to 15. This is not actually band number, it's more like band scale. So yeah, rename this to band scale, and again set the minimum value to 0. Next we're gonna create the band shift value for the input. So delete this band shift, just copy this value into the clamp node. There we go, and connect it to the input and call it band shift, and this is going to be 0 to 1, and maybe set the default value to 0.5. There we go. Alright, now we can select this and Ctrl H to hide away the unused input slots. Let's go ahead and rearrange our nodes to make more visual sense. Alright, create another group input here and connect these 2 colors. And again, Ctrl H to hide away the unused slots. And let's go back out and test our wood. Now we need some inputs to control our taint as well as the rod texture. That is this particular noise texture here. Let's go ahead and create a separate XYZ node and call this taint rod scale. And we also need a master scale for the taint and the rod as well. Create a vector math node and change this to scale, And also connect this scale to the input group and call this taint rod master scale, or maybe just scale. And up here we're gonna call this stretched. There we go. And again, let's go ahead and set the minimum and the maximum values for these inputs. Alright, for the X channel, let's connect here. For the Y channel, connect here, and Z channel, connect here, and get rid of this input value. Now let's Control Z to undo all of that, because right now we don't have any values here. So we need to copy these values to the default value, as well as setting the values here. So there we go. So now we can go ahead and connect the Y and the Z channel to the combined XYZ node to stretch the noise. Alright, now everything's good, so let's select this input group and Control H to hide away the unused input slots. Alright, next we need to create some inputs to control the taint as well as the rod. So create another group input node and connect these two values to the input. And again, these values should never exceed 0 to 1. So set this to 0, set this to 1, and this one also 0, 1. There we go. And this rod strength is going to be an input as well. So set this to 1 for now, maybe 0.5, and connect it to the input and call it rod strength. And again, set this to 0 to 1 range. Right, so this is 0, we have no rot at all, and this is 1, we have a lot of rotting in the wood. Alright, let's go back in and continue to make our wood texture, the inputs for our wood texture. Now connect this color to the input as well. This one is going to be the rot color. Alright, now that we're done with the rod, let's Control H to hide away the unused slot. And let's go here. This value, this factor value, is going to control the color variations. So we can use this factor to control the color variations. So yeah, create another group input node. And let's lower this to 0.5. Rename this to taint strength. There we go. And Control H to hide away this node. Now you can actually create another map range node to replace this color ramp, but I don't see a lot of use cases for it. So I'll just tweak this to the way I want, and I'll just leave it at that instead of creating more inputs for the material. The next thing we need to do is to create some inputs for our microtubes, or you can call it fibers or whatever. So create another group input node, and we're gonna use this value to set the scale. So let's cut these wires and set this scale to 200 for now, and connect this here. Alright, we can rename this to fiber scale. There we go. And set this to 0. Now that we have the fiber scale input, we can go ahead and delete this input value and replace it with this input node. Bring this group input node here to continue to create some more inputs. And this value is going to be the thickness of the fiber or the microtubes. Connect this here. There we go. And call it fiber thickness. Now we need to set some default values for the fiber thickness as well. So copy this value here and set this to 0 to 1. Alright. And let's go back here and also set this to 0.32 and get rid of the value input node. And the last thing about the fiber, the microtubes, is the strength of the color mixing node. It's right here. So let's go ahead and set this to 0.5 and connect it to the input group. I mean the group input node, and call it fiber strength. And let's control H to hide the slots and move it back here. Now I want this strength to also be controlling the depth of the microtubes. So I'm going to multiply this with this subtract node here. There we go. And I don't want the maximum value to be 1 because 1 is a little too strong. So I'm going to multiply this with maybe 0.1. So now the maximum value, I mean the maximum depth of the microtubes will be 0.1 instead of 1 as before. And maybe it's a little too weak, so increase this to 0.2. Yeah, you can just tweak this number however you like. We're gonna go ahead and create a map range node. There we go. Connect this strength value to the map range, and we will connect this to the to max value and the to min value to be 1. And let's create a reroute node and connect this to the reroute node. So you can see we can now control the fiber output using this fiber strength input as well. So I think it makes more sense to move this up here. Alright, that's it with the fiber. Create another group input node and connect the scale of the Voronoi texture to the input, and call this saw crease scale. Okay, the last input is going to be the strength of the saw creases. So we're going to connect this factor of the final soft light node to the input. There we go. And we will call this saw crease strength, and control H to hide all the other slots and move it back here, and rearrange the wires a bit. There we go. And much like the fibers or the microtubes, I want this saw crease strength slider to also control this saw creases output, and also control the heights of the creases. So let's go back into the node group and maybe move this down here. And we will now connect this to the multiply node here. And again, much like the fibers, we're gonna create another multiply node to control the maximum strength of the saw creases. So let's set this to 0.1 or maybe 0.2 or whatever. Just tweak however you like. For me, I'll just leave it as is. And let's go over here and create another map range node. Connect over. Alright. And for the to max value, let's set it to this, and set 1 for the to min value, and connect this to the saw crease output and get rid of these reroute nodes. And let's go ahead and play around with these values to generate some wood. Now let's say I want some dark looking wood like this, maybe even darker. There we go. And maybe increase the contrast a bit. And if the wood is new, then we can get rid of the rot. There we go. And let's increase the taint a bit to add some color variations for the wood. Now I want the wood to be very smooth, so I'm going to maybe lower the bump a bit to 0.001. There we go. And I want the wood to be a little more glossy, so we can now, so I can tweak these two values to control the maximum and the minimum roughness of the wood. So let's set this to 0.3 and the to max value to 0.1. And as you can see, we now have some very nice glossy wood. Yeah, I think the warping is a bit too strong, but it's just a matter of tweaking the input. So maybe lower the strength. There we go. And maybe decrease the scale, the XY scale a bit. There we go. And increase the strength a bit. There we go. And we can slice the wood at a different spot to get some different result. And to do that, we simply create a vector math node and just use the add operation, and we can add some x value to move the wood away from the center. And now we have some super nice looking grains, and maybe moving a little more away from the center. And for the Y channel as well, let's move it away from the center. There we go. So the wood generator is now done, and you can use it in your project to create an infinite amount of different wood materials. And by the way, if you just want to get the wood generator to use in your project, instead of going through all the troubles of creating it yourself, please consider purchasing it on my Gumroad store. Here I also have a pack of procedural flooring patterns that make use of this wood generator. So please check it out and see if it can help you finish your project a little faster. And with that, the wood material series is officially done. And if you managed to achieve this result, then congratulations! You can now boast to your friends and family that you are indeed the god of wood.